Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this virtual professional development opportunity. My name is Joe Schmidt, and I'm the Social Studies Specialist
That'd be
at the
nice.
Department of Education.
Be nice.
Today, I am happy to welcome back David Cheevers, Vice Chair of the Maine Bicentennial Commission. He's going to give us part two, talking about some Maine history. Today's topic is Maine leading up into the Civil War. Dave joined us last week where he talked about the founding of Maine and some of the early stories of Maine. Dave is the former state archivist, served in that role for 12 years, and has basically every bit of knowledge that I could possibly know about Maine.
Steady there, boy, steady. No.
Trying to build you up. I'm building time while we're getting the PowerPoint back up and running.
I'm going to shut this one then, okay?
Okay, got it. Thanks. Now here we go.
All right, the floor is yours, Dave.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank everybody for coming in. He's spoken too grandiloquently about my qualifications. All I can tell you is that for 12 years, I enjoyed my stint as Maine State Archivist with the precise idea that we were preparing for the bicentennial, that we had plenty of information. We had a slew of documents that spoke to the early years and brought us right up to where we're going in round 3, which is, I believe, next week. But a lot of the stuff that happened about statehood has been kind of lost. And it thought that if we could go back and do some of the building blocks and the issues and interests that propelled Maine to statehood, and then what they found themselves involved with as they undertook a young state's administration. I thought I'd just go through a little bit of that today. And the idea is, for those who are new this week, and I mentioned this last week, was to present the concepts through people. And the more local the people, the better, because it's their story. How they shared what they did, the kinds of things they did. They were a much more literate society than we are today, despite what we do with social media. A lot of what they did in letters, for example, will come up as we go along this afternoon. And when we think about it, I don't know how many times you get a letter. Most of them now are fundraising from politicians or government leaders. But at the time, if you received a letter from a national figure, it was a big deal. Anyway, Maine, to start the 19th century, was not over 300,000 people. So it was—
Dave, can I interrupt you really quick, Dave?
Yes.
Would you mind, can you expand out your PowerPoint to full screen? Some of it's a little hard to read with.
Can try it. How's that?
Perfect.
Better?
Yep, thank you, Dave.
Okay. So as a medium-sized small town, even today, in the 1810, 1820, 1830 range, people knew of the people. They conducted business all the time. But the core of the story remains the same, which is not only true on what we were doing with the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, but we roll it back even to the start of Maine as a state, and it turns out to be the same thing. And I'm going to introduce some of those people to you. The source material that we have at the archives is a treasure trove. And if you have any opportunity at all to conduct your research, do a little bit of enhancement to your knowledge base, the archives is a good place to go, as is the state library. Digital Maine is putting more and more things up with Maine history. And for those who have access to the Maine Historical Society, their Maine Memory Network has a lot of stuff on it. And in Maine200.org, which is the bicentennial website, we have loaded videos. We have a ton of stuff up there. All you have to do is kind of dig around with it. Maine Public Radio and television are doing some things too. And Masthead Maine, they've been doing This Day in Maine. And those things are, I think the video clips of a minute or so, and maybe sometimes a little longer. But the idea is that there's plenty of stuff out there that is being loaded up, even though it's not in a compendium that you might think would be, oh yeah, sure, we'll get a book out of this. I'm not sure that's going to happen. These books in particular have been helpful to me. Ron Banks's, the late Ron Banks, Maine Becomes a State, is invaluable. Neil Roll's narrative history is a lot of fun. Micah Pauling undid Joseph Treat's journal with Penobscot Chief John Neptune and laid that out for everybody for his doctoral dissertation. John Hodgson's compilation of the documents arising from the Civil War, you could sit for years with that and still keep finding new stuff. And if you have access to those, and obviously the archives is hoping that we can put those up onto Digital Maine, literally you could spend the rest of your life reading that. Bernard Fishman's compilation for the Maine State Museum, Maine and 112 Objects, is also a good place to go for your classes because they will find things and ask them to ask questions. Where does it go? What does it do? What does it mean? A lot of thought went into that book, and it's reasonably priced. Have the school pick up one and have fun with it. Have fun with another one, The Eminent Mainers, Doug Stover's book. I think they keep trying to add to that so they can update it. And these are people that a lot of folks probably have never heard of and may never hear of. There's some of the familiar ones are in there, but it's more interesting, the less known and not less accomplished, but the less known people. Ed Churchill's collaborative, Maine, the Pine Tree State, little more sluggish read, but he takes, and they take, fairly comprehensive looks at some of the influences of Maine history over time. And then if you can find William Williamson's, I think he has 2 or 3 volumes, History of the State of Maine. I had access to 2 of them. And when you start getting into some of the personalities of the people who were engaged at the time, and I'm sorry, they're mostly white men, but that was the way of the world at the time. When Maine becomes a state, they thought of, and this is one of the things that was fascinating to me, the Kennebec River was the eastern frontier of the United States. The Kennebec River Valley, the watershed of the Kennebec River. At the time, they didn't know where it started. It was Benedict Arnold's folly in trying to go up the Kennebec to reach Quebec. He thought the Kennebec went all the way through and went to the headwaters of the St. Lawrence. Instead, no, he finds out that it stops at Moosehead Lake and they have to go to Cary and they lose all their guys. But the reason behind that was pretty simple. Maine was well known to the English because at the time, England's idea of colonization was to grab property, to develop property, to deed out property to those who wanted to manage it, those who wanted to profit from it. So that they carved up the state and the watersheds as they deemed appropriate. Starting with the Crown, they did it. But they really ran out of room because the French had essentially taken the Penobscot and St. John rivers, and they were out there studying for different things. They were not interested in land so much as they were interested in the things they could harvest, whether the harvest was in the souls of those who lived there, or whether it was in furs, whether it was in precious metals if they could find them, whether it was in trees, but they weren't really interested in forming a society. That was a decidedly English thing, and that's as far east as they had taken it. So right after Maine becomes a state, and we don't have a northern boundary figured out, well, one of the things they realized was the nearest arsenal to the capital of Maine, or what would be the capital of Maine, Augusta, was 200 miles away. And they said, if we ever have a fight on the northern or eastern border, we better have material there. So when you come to see the Kennebec Arsenal, which is a national historic landmark, it's the most complete arsenal in existence from the 19th century. And it was much like the grocery stores of today. Each new one is the prototype for the next one. The Kennebec Arsenal was the prototype for the arsenals that were developed by the United States as they expanded west and south. And that arsenal exists today in almost, well, it's the same configuration. I don't think they've taken any buildings out. They haven't developed it as a historic site as they should, but it's there and you can see it. And that was to defend the eastern and northern frontier that was Maine. This is the actual language of the flyer that went out on July 19th, July 20th, July 21st, an election flyer urging people on the major reason why they wanted independence. And that was the right to govern themselves. That's what they thought they were going to gain. Now, we think about that, and particularly in these times with the pandemic, the right to govern ourselves has come back to haunt some of these governors whose Andrew Cuomo was pointing out. New York is what they call a gazetted state. The federal government would distinguish between states as being gazinta and gazetted. And New York is gazetted state, according to Andrew Cuomo, because they dump more money into the federal coffer than they receive back. Maine is a gazinta state. We have money that goes into Maine more than we put into the federal government. But at the time, that wasn't even really considered. Were we going to have enough money to govern ourselves? The point was we wanted to govern ourselves. And by a 2-to-1 margin on the 26th of July of 1819, that's what we got. Here's the separation vote by county at the time. You can see the tallies. And even within those tallies, there are fascinating stories on why, for example, if you look at Kennebec County, why there's such a disparity between the yays and the nays. It was a powerful thing in the Kennebec Valley to talk about independence and to talk about being a free state. And a lot of that had to do with new people who had moved in. A lot of that had to do with overriding some of the elite business concerns that happened along the river. Cumberland County had an interesting vote. York was a little closer because closer to Massachusetts, their orientation, if you will, and the opposite of orient is Occident. I don't know if we've ever occidentalized ourselves, but for York, they had a greater affinity for New Hampshire and some of Massachusetts because they were close neighbors. Further away you got, maybe not so much. Hancock County just starting, you look at that, and then this shows you Hancock County beyond the Kennebec Valley, Washington County beyond the Kennebec Valley, Penobscot. This was an area that had not seen the population growth that had been seen in Western Maine or Central Maine. Just introduce him briefly here because Rufus King was the half-brother to William King, Maine's first governor. William King was, and is generally credited as being the guy who most was driving the issue of independence from Massachusetts. And one of the things that had held that up was the coasting law. And for those of you who remember from last week, that coasting law required Maine merchants to pay for every state that it passed that was not contiguous with its own. So before they could consider independence, where they would then be paying, in essence, a tariff to New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, with the coasting law in effect, any shipper in Maine, and Maine was a shipping state, and whether it came in or whether it went out, that tariff was going to be paid. And as long as they were part of Massachusetts, being contiguous to Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, that freed them from that tariff. In repealing the coasting law, Maine shippers, the business people who were really, the commercial drivers of this, flipped and decided that they were more in favor of Maine being independent. However, this did not come freely, okay? And we talk about the Missouri Compromise and we toss it off as if it's nothing. Missouri Compromise, the Maine-Missouri Compromise. It allowed Maine to come in as a free state and Missouri could come in as a slave state. Well, Missouri was not ready to be a state. Missouri was still a territory. It doesn't become a state until 2021. What the issue was whether slavery would be allowed in Missouri. Maine was coming in as a free state. The upset in Congress was that there was going to be a shift in the balance of power. And the slave owners, slave states, looked at that balance of power as being essential to keeping their institution of slavery alive and kicking. If you had the votes to override the issue of slavery, you could abolish slavery and turn their life, their commerce upside down. They didn't want that. They wanted the slaves to continue, and for that, they wanted a balance of power to remain. And even though there was a lag between Maine entering the Union and Missouri entering the Union, what you had was enough time that Maine's entry could come in and you would not suffer any particular legislative act that would upset that balance. Nevertheless, the 7 members of the Maine delegation who voted in this, they were Maine representatives to Congress representing Massachusetts. One of them is Mark Hill. Now, Mark Hill was a guy from Phippsburg, and I bring that up because we talked about, small town. Phippsburg at the time was exceedingly small, but he was elected to serve from the District of Maine. And he goes down to Washington with the idea that he is, in essence, an abolitionist. The Democrat-Republican Party, prior to the Civil War, coming up to the 1850s anyway, early on, they were not opposed to slavery because they understood what the capitalist forces were that allowed the national economy to flourish. But they were against the idea of slavery in concept, and they certainly didn't want to see it extended. When Hill votes in favor of the Maine-Missouri Compromise, he was afraid that there would be blogs, in essence, coming after him, that the naysayers and the haters would find him out, and they would threaten him and his family. They would threaten his livelihood because he, in effect, had been a hypocrite. He saw that possibility. He felt it. So he decided that he needed to justify his vote. The justification here, if the law restricting Missouri was passed, it never could be carried into effect against her will without a resort to force, which would have produced civil war and probably disunion. He saw down the road what was going to happen if the Missouri Compromise was not approved. He votes for the Missouri Compromise and sends a letter to the citizens of Maine. Take a look at this one. Thomas Jefferson, no less, is writing to John Holmes of Alfred. John Holmes also voted for the compromise, but the issue of slavery was now paramount because it was behind all of the things. It was that 600-pound gorilla in the corner. And Jefferson was informing Holmes of what was going to happen. It is hushed indeed for the moment, but this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. Thomas Jefferson would not live to see the outbreak of the Civil War, but he could see the stirrings. He could see the seeds that were planted by extending slavery across into west of the Mississippi River and potentially into the rest of what was the Louisiana Purchase. These territories might in fact wind up slave territories and slave states, and he could see that there was going to be trouble. So he says, as it is, we have the wolf by the ear. You can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is on one scale, self-preservation in the other. Wow. Wow. That's the pressure that these guys were under. And it was a conversational pressure. It was a legislative pressure. It was a debate pressure. Holmes and Hill felt it, as did the rest of the members of the Maine delegation. And when they voted with the majority, and not all of the Maine reps did that, but when those who did voted with the majority for the Missouri Compromise, they knew that slavery was going to be extended. They knew they would have some splaining to do when they got home. Hill took care of that with a letter. But they also knew that they had kicked the slavery question down the road. Somebody else was going to have to take care of it. In the meantime, Maine legislators, Maine civic activists, Maine politicians decide that they're going to get into the act and start forming a constitution. Here's the population I was talking about. Mentioned it last time, 1820, 300,000 people. 300,000 people, but you see the jump in 60 years from 20 to 300,000. A lot of those people were in that area that the District of Maine was shown in that first map. They were on the west side of the District of Maine. The Penobscot, St. John Valley, not so much. Yeah, you had people going there, but a lot of that was traffic that was coming in from maritime British North America, which we consider to be Canada. Legislature convenes. We're going to have a new state. It's going to be part of the United States. Let's take a tally. How much money do we have in the bank? Well, you got $60,000 and $486 to toss in How are we going to administer a state with $60,000? Governor's salary, $1,500. If you extrapolate out every dollar of 1820 to what a dollar is in 2020, the Maine governor was well paid compared to the current Maine governor. I believe the salary for the current Maine governor is still, what, $75,000, but you get a nice house. Legislature convenes May 31st, 1820 in Portland. The one town that is legislated into existence by the Maine legislature in 1820 is Kennebunk, also celebrating its bicentennial. There were two other communities in Maine whose independent status as towns or communities legislatively approved, but that was done prior to March 15th, and it was done in Massachusetts. Also in here is legislation that was passed at the request of William King. I don't believe it was a gubernatorial bill, but he certainly had his fingerprints all over it. An act to modify and limit the terms and conditions of the Act of Separation relative to Bowdoin College and encourage literature and the arts and sciences. This was William King's cause. This was the reason he hung so long in the idea of statehood. He wanted to be free, not just of Bowdoin College, he wanted to be free of Massachusetts. And here's the guy who was one of the original trustees of Bowdoin. The District of Maine in 1820, you can see it here. When you go from 1787 with a self-identified Baptist population of 183, Methodist 0. The people who come to Maine, who filter in, coming across the New Hampshire border, coming up into York and Cumberland, Androscoggin and Kennebec counties, these are people largely not from our colonial ancestors. You know, the Irish were coming in, but they were coming in, you know, the other way. The French were coming down from Canada. These were a lot of the English, the Irish, the Scotch, some of the Dutch, but when they came, the predominant country was England, and the predominant religious orientation was Protestant, and the predominant Protestant denomination at the time was Congregationalist. In Massachusetts, the Congregationalists ran the show in commerce, in politics, in government. And largely, when you look at it, that was happening also in the District of Maine. It was almost a mirror image, only smaller. And this was not enough for William King. He was a Bowdoin College overseer. He had plenty of military experience coming out of the War of 1812 when he was organizing the state defense, the maritime defense for the District of Maine. And he was an early statehood booster. He saw no reason why Maine needed to be tied forever to Massachusetts. But here's Article 8. The reason Article 8 is in the Constitution and it was passed in the Maine legislature, and it's directed at secondary schooling, post-secondary schooling, the colleges, because there were only two at the time, Bowdoin College and a very, very new, as in the first student showed up in 1818, the Maine Literary and Theological Seminary. And that was an institution supported by William King and others. He was one of the early boosters. He did not come up with the idea, but he was one of the guys who was a proponent of having a second school. Because the sad fact was that the Congregationalists who were so dominant in running Bowdoin and running the District of Maine politically and commercially, they didn't care much for the Baptists and didn't allow Baptist offspring to gain admission to Bowdoin. So William King thought a second school was needed, and the Bowdoin trustees disagreed with him. Things happened, and as I mentioned in the first go-around, William King wound up being as insulted by Bowdoin as Bowdoin thought William King insulted that institution. And when he became governor, as short a term as he served, he decided that he would do the best he could to help a literary and theological seminary, which eventually becomes Colby College, And he was also going to put a layer of administration and oversight in Maine directed directly at Bowdoin College, which had received its charter from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And he said, by God, they were going to have to be chartered in Maine too. And the Maine legislature was going to oversee what they did. Shortly after he becomes governor, I mentioned Joseph Treat and John Neptune, up the Penobscot, down to St. John Rivers. And Neptune serves as his guide. He's not just a guide, he's a storyteller. He informs Joseph Treat of all of the natural stories they have, the myths that the Penobscots had, and maybe you get up into the northern part of Maine, and you change, and you might see the Passamaquoddies, you might see the Maliseets, you might see some Micmac, but Neptune, these guys all knew one another, much like the colonists of Maine essentially knew one another. They knew of each other, and there were not the kind of, at least the overt controversies among the tribes as would have been seen in the early 1700s. Identified in part because Neptune is willing to work with Joseph Treat. Joseph Treat comes back with the maps, he comes back with the myths, he comes back with the descriptions of the natural environment of central, northern, and eastern Maine. And as he does so, he uses anglicized spelling of a lot of the terms that Neptune gave him. And when you take out, we used to have a Dirigo Atlas, or I mean, not a Dirigo, but Delorme Atlas of Maine. And you look at all of the Indian names in there, and many of them are due, in fact, to the precedent that Joseph Treat established to honor the Indians, to honor their naming, because it was an area that we knew. All right, let's get to Portland a little bit. Year-round city, seaport, Maine's first capital. Population in 1820, just about 8,500 people. Obviously, it's grown quite a bit, and it was going to grow quite a bit for obvious reasons. At the time, Portland enjoyed 6 militia companies, 5 militia companies. They were 2 rifle guards, a rifle corps, a light guard, and a light infantry. There might have been an artillery group, but I don't know if it had been disbanded by then. Disbanded. These were arising from what had taken place in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. And these militia companies self-identified, and they weren't terribly active. They would come together monthly, they would march, they would have their meetings. But as these guys aged a little bit and they kind of went away, and some of the younger guys would come in, but these militia companies fell into a state of disrepair. By 1835, there were a lot of ex-militia guys who were walking the streets of Lewiston, they're walking the streets of Portland and Saco, and they were identified by Maine legislators. It's like, here are these guys, 65, 70, 75 years old, and they're on street corners, they're walking around, they have very little to say for themselves, other than the fact that they got cheated. That when they fought in the Revolutionary War, that they had been promised by Massachusetts that if they survived, they wouldn't necessarily receive payment in money. Massachusetts didn't have money. What it had was property. What it had was property in Maine. And a lot of these guys were supposed to be receiving property based in size on what their eventual rank was in the militia that helped Massachusetts in the Revolutionary War. Well, the Revolutionary War records kind of disappeared. And when Maine legislators tried to figure out why these old guys were begging on the street and what had happened to them, they came in and one of the acts in the new State House in Augusta is they passed a Revolutionary War Land Bounty Act. And what it sought to do was to redress the reneging of Massachusetts and restore to these veterans, to the best of their ability, what had been owed to them. And all the veterans had to do was submit an affidavit. And I'll send this along, but Digital Maine has these things up. They're fascinating reading. The veterans would provide the affidavits to the state would provide land to the veterans, and today, the only record that we have of the men who served in the Revolutionary War from Maine are those affidavits signed by these aged men whose memories might have become a little bit dim, but their stories checked out. You want to have your kids read something? You want to read something? Go back and take a look at these. I think they've been transcribed. I think we had a couple of programs going where people would come in, if they found the cursive reading difficult, they could go on, see that those had been transcribed. But this is where these guys would, and what would happen is they could accept the land, which some of them did, and they would go out and through their families, their sons, their grandsons, they would develop some property up in, Somerset and Franklin County areas, or Northern Cumberland County, or Kennebec. And if they didn't want to do that, there were land agents, forest agents, who were willing to pay them to manage or to purchase the land from these veterans and provide them the money that they could live for the rest of their lives. Well, that's 1835. We didn't know the northern boundary of Maine any more in 1838 than we did in 1835 than we did in 1820. It had been left indistinct. And because the harvesting of Maine lumber, Maine masts, the King's masts, had proceeded upriver and in from New Brunswick, down from Quebec, up the Penobscot, they were looking for hardwood, they were looking for pine, they were looking for spruce and fir. And what they thought was, here was this land that seems to be ours. So the British started making incursions into what is now Aroostook County. And the original Aroostook County extended well up across the headwaters of the St. Lawrence. And that was the area that the Maine government insisted it could defend. And the answer was no, it couldn't. Not really. Nevertheless, we sent militia up there. The United States sent militia from as far away as South Carolina. And they sought, as these guys were staring at each other in armed camps in Aroostook County, that there's got to be a better way. We'll get a diplomatic solution out of this. The negotiations between Daniel Webster and Alexander Bering, known as Lord Ashburton, resulted in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1843. Not a shot was fired in anger by either side in the Great Aroostook War. One of the things that is in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, or more appropriately, what isn't in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, is a full definition of what the extradition was going to be between British North America, the provinces of Canada, and the United States, and in particular the state of Maine. There had to be an extradition provision within the treaty because you had separate countries. And if you had alleged perpetrators of significant crimes crossing an international boundary, you had to have some sort of way to get them back so that they could stand prosecution. Well, within that extradition, as explained in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, sure, if you're accused of murder or rape or major theft, any major crime, piracy, you would be extradited back to the venue of the crime, and then you would stand to testify in your behalf. But one of the things they forgot to do, or maybe Webster was smart enough not to do it anyway. You want to kick the slavery thing down the road a little piece? They were not going to resolve slavery in 1838 or 1843. He certainly was not going to help the southern states by claiming, because he knew the difference, being an attorney, that a runaway slave was committing a major crime. So in fact, when you had a runaway slave reach Canada, he and she would not be extradited. It wasn't in the treaty. The southern states went slightly ballistic. 1855, Neil Dow, temperance guy, pushes an abstinence order for the city of Portland. He's elected mayor. This is his military uniform. Portland at the time had the distinction, for those of you from last week, as being the rum capital of the United States. Because of its harbor, because of the provisions of everything, there was a lot of rum that passed in and out of the port of Portland. And a lot of it was consumed by the people who worked in the port of Portland. And just, I'll recount the anecdote, but Dow pushed the abstinence order, and because he was the government official in charge, doctors who had prescribed medicinal alcohol needed a supply of it. And that supply was going to be provided by the city, which required somebody to sign for the invoice. So Neil Dow signed a $1,600 invoice for alcohol that he put into storage and kept away from the people who wanted to use it, as opposed to those who were prescribed its use. And naturally, those who wanted the rum, wanted access to the alcohol, took the issue right to his front door. He calls up two of the militia companies I cited earlier, the rifle companies. They show up ready for action, thinking, you know, this is nuts. You can't really be arguing about this. But when they found out how truly angry and how boisterous the crowd was becoming and how numerous, they became increasingly anxious about it. So anxious that they thought the crowd was going to rush them. And one of the guys, there was one guy who tried to break into the building, and they shot him. And he died. He was 26 years old. He was a dock worker, and he was engaged to be married, or either that or just been married. But he had a loved one of you know, acute care, and she's left a widow. And Neil Dow, upon learning that the young man had succumbed, his only question to those who had delivered the news to him was he Irish? The Irish already had a sense along the dock that maybe these guys were too fond of their rum. One of the other guys, and this begins in 1845, but continues on up through to the Civil War. John Poor, businessman, begins in southwestern Maine, winds up in Bangor, founds the Portland Company, still in existence. And by the time of the Civil War, and I'm going to lead up to this a little bit more, but John Poor was asked to serve by Israel Washburn on a 3-person panel to alert the federal government about, you know, what really exists in this state of Maine about which they should care. And John Poor was a proponent of the railroad, not just the railway between Portland and Montreal, but he was a booster of the Grand Trunk Railroad and wanted to extend rail traffic all the way right up into maritime Canada, westward into the United States as far as it would go. Roughly that same time, just thought I'd throw this in, and found this little bit. We have newspapers, and the old newspapers in the state library. You can look this one up. John Wilkes Booth was performing Richard III and the Corsican Brothers in Portland in March and April of 1861. He extended his stay. He was only supposed to be there in March, but he was a bit of a ladies' man, and he was having a lot of fun. So he offered to those who had asked him to perform theatrics in Portland if he would stay, and he agreed to do so. But on April 13th, when he learns that Fort Sumter was fired upon, Booth, who was a Virginian, decided that maybe it would be good for him to get out of this northern state and get out in a hurry. He left without paying his bill, and the newspapers really got after him a little bit. John Poor and Ruel Williams, an Augusta politician who served in the United States Senate as Secretary of the Navy, or Committee Chairman of the Navy Committee, and Hannibal Hamlin, now out of Hamden and Bangor, who was Vice President. They're the 3-person panel. They write to the governor their report. Israel Washburn reads this, sends it along, and you can see, obviously, the tactical interest in the federal government of why Portland would be considered important. It's not just that it's a safe harbor, it's the tie to the railroad. And here is a statement of Portland exceptionalism that for those who are from there, they already know this, but for those who are from away, they soon learn there's a reason why Casco Bay, there's a reason why Portland is so highly thought of. And it was even then, and it just needed this articulation. Nobody else had really done it up until then. But in the letter from Washburn to Abraham Lincoln, a letter drafted by John Poor, but signed by Washburn, they're able to talk about Portland's place in the pantheon of harbors in the universe as they knew it. So obviously, this would be important at the outbreak of a war if you had, somebody hanging around you didn't want. The fact was, and had happened, that you could get 500 or 600 ships into Portland Harbor undetected. And you could do that right on through the Second World War. If you look at the sheltering of the Liberty ships that were being built in South Portland and on the docks in Portland during World War II, the U-boats of the Germans could not see the Liberty ships in Casco Bay because they were being sheltered. They were in harbor, and there was no way that anybody could tell how many there were unless you happened to be there. That brings us up to the sort of the present. Anyway, Lincoln responds. They appropriate $100,000 to arm Maine forts. But after the Civil War, it becomes rather noticeable that the cannon had never arrived, and neither the cannon balls or the gunpowder. But the fact that the appropriation was voted upon successfully was the word that was sent to the English and the French, who at the time were neutral observers in the early days of the Civil War. And Lincoln wanted them to remain neutral, if not join with the Union cause. And he made it clear that if anybody tried to sneak in the back door, the eastern frontier of the United States, that those harbors would be well protected, and particularly Portland. That was enough of a notice, and there was a bit of seizure of a ship out in the open ocean that helped propel the interest further. That incident and the fact that the appropriation and the interest by the federal government kept England and France at bay. They may have stayed that way anyway. Diplomatically, the Union had a leg up on the Confederacy, even though the Confederacy had that wealth of natural resources that were being sent to Europe. Once those were shut off, obviously there was some keen interest on which way England and France and to some degree Spain and Italy might go. Well, at the time that the letter from Israel Washburn arrives in Washington, the English and the French fleets were in Halifax, Nova Scotia, just on the other side of the eastern side of the Gulf of Maine. So hello, nice to see you guys, hope you stay there. Get a change of administration. Obviously, Governor Washburn had been a 5-term member of Congress, had been responsible for the split of the Democrat-Republican Party and the naming of the Republican Party in 1855 and 1856. This is one of the few pictures of John Hodgson, the Adjutant General. And for most people in Maine, most people anywhere, this is somebody they'd never heard of. But he was primarily responsible for the records that so dominate the state of Maine's archives holdings and are so important because they form the most complete set of records of domestic, military, or governmental interest of any state, north or south. In part because in 1840, Maine was, 1860 rather, Maine was 40 years old. Didn't know what they were doing, hadn't been really through a war. Great Aroostook War didn't count. Things were, shall we say, challenging, and Hodgson decided that he was going to make sure that the people who served would be recorded. They would not be treated as the Revolutionary War veterans were by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So when he transmits the Adjutant General's reports and provides a retirement letter in 1867, this is what this public servant said. And it is the best tribute to their worth, to the people who nobly volunteered for the defense of the country. Hodgson kept the records. He was smart enough to make them. He was even smarter to keep them. And those records sit in the Maine State Archives. He was smart enough to make them and smarter to keep them. letters from towns throughout the state, people wondering what to do about a host of things, a missing husband, a missing father, an encouragement to allow somebody to be promoted or somebody be allowed to enlist. Or what do we do about general welfare? What do we do with the widow? What do we do with the orphan? All of these questions were coming in, and they were precedent-setting questions because nobody had asked them before. They had no answers. But the one thing they had, and one thing that we kind of hit on the way by, is that Maine in 1860 was the same as Maine in 1820, and it's the same essentially as Maine today. We didn't have enough money. We didn't have enough cash for our needs. And if a dime was going to be spent by the government, if $1 was going to be spent, if $10 was going to be spent, there was going to be a record of it. They were going to know what it went for and why. And thus, they kept the records. Civil War statistics, just to give you an idea, by the time, 40 years after 1820, we've gone from 300,000 people to over 625,000 people. We're still booming as a state. Maine is considered a high growth area. We had a greater influx. We had greater immigration to Maine in the first half of the 19th century than what we have with snowbirds going to Florida. It didn't seem, it's like counterintuitive. Why would they come to this climate? Why would they come to this part of the United States when it would seem that there would be so many other better places you might go? Because this is going to challenge you. Look at the size of the average guy serving in the Army in the Civil War from the state of Maine. 5'7" and 145 pounds, about the size of a JV basketball player on a middle school team. Not big men. This is the average size. You see the number of men who served, the age of majority then, 18 years, 6 months, when somebody could sign up by himself. And the average age of the soldier from Maine in the Civil War was 23 years old. Half of them, half of the 56,000 guys who served in the Army in the Civil War, identified their vocation as farming. Farming. They were in agriculture. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Maine had over 60,000 family farms. Family farms, not plantations. You grew what you could eat. And if you had some left over, maybe you could have a farmer's market. But essentially, you plowed your own land. You did not have slaves. You might have a worker, you might have the family help you out, you might have a neighbor help you out. But they were family farms. And by comparison, fine, you can go through the Industrial Revolution all you want. But there were 60,000 farms in Maine in 1860. Today, there are just over 6,000 farms. That's the drop. You can see the mortality of the men who served in the Army. We do not have in the Maine State Archives. You'd have to go to the National Archives because the Navy was federalized from the very beginning. The Army was not until the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. Militia companies, like the 5 from Portland, the 6 from Portland County Artillery, like the guys from Lewiston, like the guys from Belfast and Bath, they were militia companies. They were local companies to handle local issues. They could be called up for 90 days. They weren't to be called up for 3 years at a crack. They weren't supposed to be active duty. These were the conundrums I forget what the plural is, but Israel Washburn and John Hodgson had to wrestle with. When the draft occurs, a week and a half after the Civil War, after the Battle of Gettysburg, right? That's July 4, add 10 days. July 13, 14, 15, in the county seats in Maine, they have the draft lottery. And during the time of the draft run by the federal government, that federalized guys who were going to be in the military, that wasn't going to be militia anymore. So that the latter half of 1863, all of 1864 and early 65, these guys were entering into the federal army. There was now a union army. It was not made up of militia companies. Here you see the effectiveness of a federal program on a populace that had supported by volunteers the efforts of the Civil War in admirable percentages. But when you get to the back end of that group, when they see the devastation, when they know of the death, they know of the dismemberment, they know of the disease, they know what happens to these guys, and they're going, wow, that price is too high. And so some of the remaining guys who turn 18 and a half, 19, 20, 21, you know, they go out and look for them. The provost marshals go out and try to scour them up. They go by the 1860 census and trying to locate guys who should have volunteered. And they are now eligible for the draft. And they draft 16,087 men, and you find out how many wound up having to serve. These are the schmoes who couldn't find a substitute, who couldn't claim a physical disability, couldn't claim that they were really Canadian or some of the non-resident. They could have been in from New Hampshire. They could have been from Minnesota. There were some who had uncertain identity. And some of them, because the records kept at the time were not entirely accurate, was an unsuitable age. Guys had aged beyond the time that they could be drafted, or some were still too young. And out of all of that, you really only had about 1,900 who failed to report at all, who got their draft notice and said, I'm not doing this. And it could have been late in time. But anyway, there's the effectiveness of your federal program. Brought this number up in the first week, and again, these are records that exist in the Maine State Archives. The number of families who received aid following the Civil War, and the aid was for disability and for the widows and the orphans. Now, this is all stuff, and it's William Whitman, Charles True, 1865, their report. 122,000 family members. In 1862 to 1866, you look at that, it's almost $2 million in aid. That aid would continue to be paid out into the 1920s as some of the widows continue to live off welfare from the federal government for losing a spouse in the Civil War. These are the things that you just look at and go, wow, this is amazing. How much time do we have left? Joe?
Technically 2 or 3 minutes, but there is nothing scheduled after. Last time we had a tight stop, but this time if you've got to go over a little bit, that's okay.
Well, that's okay. What I was going to get into a little bit, and I'll do that next time, because frankly, the issue of slavery is not resolved in the Civil War. And I'll give you one anecdote to kind of indicate that. In September, get this, in September of 2013, Adjutant General Campbell and a delegation of the Maine Army National Guard, the direct lineal descendants of the militia companies that served Maine in the Civil War, went to the Gettysburg battlefield. Now, today's National Guard are draftees, not draftees, they're volunteers, much as the original militia companies were. These guys volunteered likewise to go to Gettysburg. They'd never been, most of them. And General Campbell took them down, and they thought, you know, what we ought to do is, there were 15 units from Maine that were involved in the Battle of Gettysburg, and they wanted to touch the ground that each of those regiments hit over the battlefield. And they did a pretty good job of it. But they thought, you know, the crowning achievement of this might be on a September day if they returned the Maine soldiers to Little Round Top, where the 20th Maine had exemplified the ingenuity, the stubbornness, the aggression, the commitment, the dedication, the obedience, all of that stuff that is heaped on them in praise for their acts at Gettysburg, and what Joshua Chamberlain had done in leading these guys, some of them who had been reluctantly added to the regiment. They're at Little Round Top, which the locals called the Knob. They didn't even call it Little Round Top till well after the war. But as Chamberlain and the 20th Maine sweep down the hill, capture the Alabamans and the Texans, and then are told that they have to go up Big Round Top. They have to go up the larger hill after dark and scoot out the Confederates. That was the act of bravery. These guys were dead tired, hungry, thirsty, spent. And when Chamberlain is given the orders to go up Big Round Top, Would you go up Round Top, please, and clear out the Confederates who were there? Steeper climb, much more rugged climb. And Chamberlain looked at his men and he said, I cannot speak for them, but I shall go and the color guard will accompany me. And if the rest of the regiment wishes to join, they can do so. And with that, he marches forward up Big Round Top. He goes up Round Top, but he doesn't go by himself because the rest of the regiment falls in behind him. Again, willingly doing so despite having already spent, better part of 6 hours engaged in a firefight with the Confederates. And going up that hill, they were scared for their lives, scared to death. So anyway, we get to September of 2013. The Maine National Guard goes there and says, it'd be a good thing. Why don't we see if the Texans and Alabamans want to come up? So he sends a letter to the adjutant generals in Texas and Alabama. And sure enough, they said, that'd be a nice thing to do because there was a lot on both sides in the Battle of Gettysburg. So sure enough, here come representatives from the National Guards of Alabama and Texas onto Little Round Top. They're in the parking lot in September of 2013. And one of the wise guys from our own state of Maine looks across at his compatriots from the South and says, hey, now that you're up here, how do you enjoy the view? A fight breaks out. These guys are insulted that the Maine National Guard is rubbing their nose into it 150 years later. Campbell comes back a little nonplussed. He comes to my office, he goes, Dave, you don't believe it. So we'll probably go fisticuffs with these guys because they're insulted. And he says, yeah, my guy was, cracking wise, but he said, the wounds are still there. You cannot leave. In fact, you can't do anything in the Maine National Guard without dealing with something touched by, influenced by the Civil War. Whether you're at Camp Chamberlain, named after Joshua Chamberlain, or Camp Keyes, named after Erasmus Darwin Keyes, the Civil War in Maine remains every place. And that's what helped us when we were doing our commemoration of the sesquicentennial. We put together over 264 stories that still are available on the Maine State Archives site. And I think we're putting them on Digital Maine. I use the editorial we, where they began with a sole source, a single source, an original source document of some kind. Could have been a photograph, could have been a government record, could have been a letter. And in it, identified a person, a place, a date, and an issue. Some of them mundane, some of them very, very serious, all of them sincere. And in those 260 plus stories, we learn about people in the state of Maine and what they were interested in and how they did. It was one of the more fascinating and enriching projects that the people and now all of those guys, by the way, all of the guys who contributed to that have retired. And I'm no longer there. So, but the information still is. The original information in the stories that were drawn from them. And if you have some interest in it, let Sam Howes or Heather Moran or Kate McBrien, the new archives director, let them know that you're interested in it. And they can either make them available to you, send them, whatever. But it is something that if you're looking for, particularly where you get into the individual communities, that's been part of the fun of doing the sesquicentennial presentations in the schools. I've done over 90 of them. And in each case, going to a town and grabbing the company with the largest number of men who served from that community and giving them the roster of that becomes something that these guys can't get enough of. We come across family names. Here, I'll go back at the beginning again. We come across stories and we get deeper and deeper into the great-great-grandfather's life and the life that leads down through as the descendants begin to fill in the rest of their stories. And those classroom experiences have been immediate, and it brings the Civil War home to them in a way that you can't really in discussing the 30,000-foot view. Anyway, Maine becomes much more of a state because of the Civil War. And the forces that were leading to the Civil War, that whole slavery question, we'll sprinkle through that the next time But the fact is that the Civil War became the most disruptive and transformative event in Maine history, and Maine's performance in the Civil War, the impact of Maine upon the Civil War and the Civil War upon Maine, you just can't overstate them. They're enormous. And some of the best people, ordinary people, everyday people, whether they're from Pittsburgh or Alfred, whether they're from Biddeford, Augusta, Hamden, Oxford, these are guys who stepped forward, women who stepped forward and contributed to not just the outcome, but contributed to the very essence of the state of Maine. Questions? See if I can get rid of this. Anybody still on?
Yep, we've still got almost 20 people stuck around. Does anybody have any questions for Dave? I did not see any in the chat box at all during the time. Oh, let me give you the ability to unmute yourself if you do have a question. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask Dave or put it in the chat box. I know a lot of people had to run around the 2 o'clock time.
Not surprised.
I do have a question.
Go ahead.
Dave, going into the schools, do you still do that? And if so, what age range do you prefer?
Really, when you get down to it, 5th grade is about as young as you can go.
Okay.
You can at least talk to them about the Civil War and they can grasp some of it. But I didn't make it to Washington County and I didn't make it to Aroostook. But every other county in Maine I've been to, and yeah, the information is still there. The program is still there. I'm more than glad to do it. It's it begins with the core elements of Maine and the Civil War, but it's individualized to that town. So the main town in the school district. But I did it to Valley High School and middle school in Bingham. Had 126 students, the entire grade 7, 8 through 12. Entire student body. I was down in Berwick and had 210 7th and 8th graders. They can be down as, do it as few as 15, 10, and that becomes much more immediate. But finding the people who served and being able to tell the stories of where they went and what they did, you're going to get a couple of those. You can tune in next week to round 3, because in many ways, the guys who were from Maine helped determine the outcome of the war.
Right.
Were aware of it at the time. It would only come afterwards when they realized the importance of the things that they did. Mm-hmm. So yeah, if you have an age group that you think can handle it and you think that there's some value, just let us know.
So would we contact you or
the Secretary of State's office? Nikki Ladner runs it. There are programs that school programs that she helps coordinate, and she would let me know and we'd figure it out.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Dave before we stop recording? Anything you'd like recorded for posterity's sake? Well, let me get on the recording then. Dave, thank you very much again for part 2. I love to just see how entranced everybody is with all the different stories and listening. So thank you for your time.
No, thank you. And I'll get the PowerPoint over to you for distribution if you want.